reference. So yeah, so thanks everyone. Hello. It's a kind of pleasure and privilege to be able to talk to you today in these weird times. So thanks for joining. I'm going to spend about the next 30 minutes trying to cover about 4 years of insight from my experience as a designer working on products and services in what is, for me, an extraordinary context, surgery. So this session is really an outside-in view of healthcare. So I'm not a healthcare professional, but I've been lucky enough to be part of the healthcare world as a design professional. So specifically, I'm an experienced designer. So everything I do is based on human-centered design principles, which kind of follows a lot of the conversations and sessions that have been happening today. And so this is my most basic version of what I do. So I try and understand people to make better things. So based on that, I thought it would be useful to tell my story in 3 chapters. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the challenge of learning a whole new set of languages and ecosystems to try and get a deeper understanding of the context I was going to be designing for. Then secondly, I'll spend a bit of time going through some of the research and design activities that were framed by those extraordinary contexts. I can tell you now, some of it to me was mad, it was mental. Lastly, I'll explore some of kind of the wider challenges I faced when considering end-to-end service architectures for clinical workflows that really were about putting the patient at the center of everything. First things first, so just so you know what products and services we're talking about. So the company I've worked for or with over the last 4 years is Cydar Medical. They're based in Cambridge in the UK. So just for clarity, I don't work for Cydar or have any specific affiliation with them, but you kind of need to know about what they do for the purposes of the story. And actually, they're just exceptionally smart and dedicated people anyway. So kind of, I'm happy to call them out just for that. So Cydar's primary focus is fusion imaging. So more specifically, I work with them on fusion imaging products used in endovascular surgery. So it's basically a lot of smart computational mathematics and machine learning that optimizes the clinician's workflow in this type of surgery. But most importantly, dramatically reduces the amount of radiation and chemicals required, which is obviously a huge advantage for patients. And there's 3 main parts to the workflow that uses different Cydar products. So there's planning for surgery, where 3D overlays of arterial systems are generated from CT scans. There's preparing for surgery, where clinicians access patient data and models in the cloud and ready them for surgery. And there's during surgery, when those arterial models are automatically aligned to patients' vertebra for more precise guidance for surgeons. So that's a really high-level overview of the products and services, but what did we actually do? Well, my first project with Cydar was focused on optimizing the in-theatre experience, looking at the design of the interface of the fusion imaging guidance platform, which they call Cydar EV for endovascular. So this was my first immersion into the world of clinical healthcare, and so I soon found out, oh my, there was a lot to learn from an outside-in view. So this is Tom. So Tom is a founder and owner of Cydar. So he's a surgeon, and he was explaining to my colleague Isabel and myself the elements of an operating theatre and how their product fits into the environment. So we realised pretty quickly there's going to be lots of new kind of nomenclature for us to become familiar with. Now, this was his rendition of the operating theatre and all of the objects and actors that occupy that space. By the way, we also found that if you talk to surgeons, they always end up drawing a picture of an operating theatre. So There must be some German word for that. And one of the interesting things for us was how many things had multiple names or labels, all of which were kind of valid, but very specific. And we also had to learn a whole new language around the correct technical terms for some of the things that related to this kind of surgery, including common acronyms and synonyms and alternate kind of colloquial labels. I mean, I had no idea what abdominal aortic aneurysm or what AAA was. I really didn't have much idea about arterial systems and how they link to internal organs. Quite worryingly, I quickly learned I had all the hallmarks of the highest risk group for whatever a AAA was, which was fantastic. So the further we got into it, the bigger our library of new terms was getting. And then there was the growing library of things. Not only what these things are, stent grafts in this case, but why they're used, how they're used, and the different categories of these things. And ultimately, we needed to understand and follow a narrative for how all these things come together in the context of an operation. So why did we do all this? Well, part of our experience design process, and most experienced designers' process, is to talk to people, to understand what they do in their own context, in order for us to make better design decisions about how we approach designing for better outcomes. Now, we had planned interviews with surgeons who were already using the product in theatre, and we knew a couple of things about surgeons, which I think referenced in a couple of presentations earlier today, a couple of things that were really important. They're very short on time, and they're very highly focused. So in order to facilitate a meaningful conversation and not waste their time, it was critical to establish a level of trust between us and them, and that meant demonstrating knowledge and understanding of their area of specialism. True, we had to ask them to clarify things throughout, but the main thing was to avoid the "who is this idiot" scenario. And we spoke to lots of surgeons and got excellent qualitative insights into their process, their current experience with using the product, and what their thoughts were on product improvement based on their workflow. In fact, we got lots of insights. It turns out that when you get surgeons talking, it's actually quite difficult to make them stop. Great for research, but sometimes difficult to keep up. And I'm 100% sure we would have not got to the same level of detail and engagement if we had simply turned up without acquiring the depth of knowledge that we did. In fact, my favourite participant in the research actually tested us at the beginning of an interview with a couple of procedural scenarios before he was really happy to talk to us at all. And why not? He was giving us an hour of his precious time, so he wanted to be sure that it wasn't going to be wasted. And yes, we got more drawings of operating theatres and arterial systems, but hey, we knew what they were talking about, and that's what was important. We only gained as much insight as we did because we could maintain a meaningful conversation based on the effort we'd put into understanding the context. All of which enabled us to move into the design phases of various projects with lots of confidence about what might make a good outcome. But we were designing for extraordinary contexts. Like many designers, I'm kind of used to making things that people will use with pretty much a whole desktop or laptop screen in front of them on desk, or using a mobile phone with pretty much distraction-free. And we're often evaluating products and services in lab conditions, where we probably have a significant level of control over the environment. And in fact, most recently, we've just been discussing, we're doing lots of remote research due to the current circumstances, which has its own unique characteristics. But I was about to find out there's some particular challenges designing for a surgical environment. So this is a version of Barb. Yeah, absolutely. Respect their time and do our homework, 100%. So this is a version of the in-theatre product, which uses the 3D fusion imaging to help surgeons in endovascular surgery. It uses live fluoroscopy on the left-hand side of the screen and maps in real time the 3D image of the arterial system moving in 3D space as the patient or X-ray position moves. The brief for us really was to improve the overall user experience. So we needed to conduct contextual research to evaluate a number of things we needed to design for. And that meant getting into the operating theatre. Now, I had my own expectations of what an operating theatre was like, and it was a bit like this, kind of clean and bright and shiny and lots of room to move about in. Everything kind of works and everything's in its right place. In fact, this is the actual operating theatre at the Royal Free Hospital in London, where we're going to be observing the product being used during operations. But in reality, operating theatres are a bit more like this. So it's a bit more busy, bits and pieces all over the place, and really not much room to move about in. You see, there's also sheets of plastic and things everywhere, in this case, pretty dark. Now, I normally put a close-up picture of endovascular surgery at this point, just to make a point, but it's pretty soon after lunch in the UK, and we're all sat in front of screens, so I think I'll leave that one to your imagination. Now, while I was in theatre observing, I couldn't do what I would normally do during research, take lots of photos. So instead, I had to draw really terrible pictures of what was going on. And there was a lot going on. There were people everywhere, lots of bits of equipment, and so many things competing for attention. You might be able to see the patient right in the middle there, who's looking quite happy for some reason, and multiple surgeons and support staff who were coming and going during the few hours that I was in there. And the environment itself was something I wasn't expecting either. Kind of not hot or cold, not dry, not damp, just a strange kind of ambience. But what was most useful to understand was the view of the product on screen from the point of view of the surgeon who was trying to use it. So that interface I showed you earlier, that's on a TV screen across the bed from the surgeon. And this was my attempt at kind of a surgeon's eye view. The screen they're looking at is right there in the middle, but you might notice a couple of ghostly figures on the other side of the bed. So this is where I realized things weren't going to be quite as simple as I'm used to. So here's the screen I'm talking about. It looks pretty big, quite easy to see, but it's actually a little bit further away than that. So things get a little bit more difficult to make out. In fact, it's even further away than that. And there are all these other screens hanging from the ceiling, overlapping with each other. And being the NHS in the UK, there's also a couple of dead ones on the wall. Sorry about that. And all of these screens have really important looking stuff on them, all competing for attention. I have no idea what all the graphs and numbers and things were, but it was all a bit mesmerizing. Well, apart from those blue screens of death on the side there. And then you put a bed in between the surgeon and the screens. And of course, you drop a patient in there, not literally, but just for a fact. And then you get these guys on the other side of the bed. And they're standing right in front of the thing you're trying to look at. I mean, I'm wondering how to optimize the interface design for this product, and the user can't even see most of it. In fact, Tara, the surgeon at the time, was constantly leaning around to see the screen while trying to put wires up patients' arteries. I couldn't quite believe it. And then some other surgeons or other are coming and going over here. And it's actually a bit darker than this. It's probably on fire, and it's raining, and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are riding through or something. But the point is, this was not the context I was used to designing for. So the contextual research was critical for me to understand this extraordinary environment. Now, I could talk about this project for hours, but really the key outcomes from research were: don't overcomplicate things. Surgeons hate clutter, and there's already so much competition for attention. Don't give me things I can't use. While the interface was touch enabled, in theatre, most users couldn't touch. And just let me know everything was working. So we had to address a challenge around small delays in updating and how that was perceived. And this on the screen is the result. I mean, it's singularly the most boring thing I've ever designed, but it was based on specific needs of users in this extraordinary context. So a related project included designing for physical interactions with digital products in the theatre context. Cydar developed a capability to dynamically change the shape of anatomy on screen during operations, which you manipulated using a remote control. So again, we headed into the theatre to really understand how surgeons would use this device in their context. So here's my colleague Mike, looking studious in the control room. And here's Mike again, pretending to be invisible in a room full of clinicians. But here's Mike, all scrubbed up in his lead suit with Cal, one of the developers from Cydar, ready to head into theatre to observe the device being used in context. And once again, once we were in there, I drew really terrible pictures of what was going on. And again, there was an awful lot going on. In fact, there were more surgeons than I've ever seen in one room. And they were all doing really important things, focused on their tasks and interacting with each other seamlessly, all working together. Including, in this case, trying to find a remote control that they'd used once, put down somewhere and couldn't find again. Which is another illustration to me that, while it's potentially easy to design a product and assume how it gets used in the real world, without the contextual context, you're never going to know that a surgical bag might make a remote control unusable. Or if there's no way to put it, that's really annoying. Or that the basic workflow has fundamental issues based on a presumption of a user's mental model. And this was a fascinating project for many reasons. I can talk about this one for hours too, but I have one more example to show you that required us to get deeper into the context of use. So during the process of planning endovascular surgery, clinicians use an application to segment sections of arterial systems in CT scans and extract them to generate the 3D models used in the operating theatre. At the time we were working on this, it was still a reasonably intensive manual process. We were looking primarily at the application workflow to optimize the experience for clinicians and other users. As a side note, Cydar can now pretty successfully automate this process through machine learning, but that's something for another time. The main challenge was perhaps maybe a little bit of developer showing in the interface. The application worked and some really great features, but it didn't map to the mental model of clinicians using it as part of their workflow as well as it could. So we talked with vascular surgeons and observed them using the planning tool in the hospital environment to evaluate where the opportunities for improvement were. And it really centered on workflow. The capabilities and features of the planning tool were actually very good. And I spent hours of fun flying through CT scans, turning bits of bones on and off to make scary half-formed people. And the tools were great. But the feedback from surgeons was that the interactions were counterintuitive based on what they wanted to do and when. So I broke it down into key workflow stages and designed interactions and interface components that more closely reflected what users expected at different stages. Not really any change to the application features or capabilities, but a slightly different narrative for how those things were arranged. So while the result doesn't look drastically different, it's the more subtle things like affordances, information hierarchies, and changes in state that can have significant impact when it comes to meeting expectations and supporting repeat usage. And while this was a pretty small project on the overall roadmap, it was the depth of knowledge, the acquisition of the language of surgery, and the developing relationship with the product owners and clinicians in the hospitals that enabled us to move quickly and make informed decisions. So we'd been exposed to a whole new context in which we were practicing experience design based on human-centered design principles. And the more we learned through those relationships, the more confidently we could operate in those environments. And yes, that is a terrible pun, I'm afraid. So third part of this story is about how we moved from a product-based offering to a patient-centered service, focused around how the products come together to support an end-to-end clinician workflow. As the products have developed to support specific clinical activities, they've evolved into their own unique brands, all part of a workflow, but seen as different products with distinct capabilities. What we wanted to do was bring the products together so they were perceived as a coherent service offering rather than a set of useful standalone products. So we looked at a service proposition that responded to the needs of clinicians, but also positioned the product capabilities as a more integrated workflow. And it was essential that we defined a kind of an extensible roadmap of service enhancements that aligned to both the needs of the customers, clinicians, and the aspiration for the business, Cydar, to grow. So we spent a few days evaluating all the current product capabilities, feature plans, and the needs of clinicians based on everything we'd learned to date to prioritize features and think about how the service proposition might look. But the key to the proposition was really how we described the service in relation to how it could be the obvious choice for clinicians specializing in this kind of surgery. And to start defining that, I took a step back from the detail and tried to understand the simplest form of the message we were trying to communicate. I try and do this by abstracting the elements of the service and by some magic or other defining the essence of the service. That's to say, I write random words down and hope they somehow come together in the most meaningful statement possible. Not as meaningful as the vision statement that we had earlier, but somewhere getting close to that, hopefully. And as these statements begin to form, I just capture them as a kind of tagline for the service, good, bad, or mostly kind of indifferent. But iterating on these and relating them to the needs of clinicians on a daily basis and how we get learned they describe their own practice, some phrases just kept rising to the surface. And critically, when we put the patients at the heart of everything, the proposition began to move away from technical capabilities or even the idea of products in a workflow toward a more holistic, patient-centered view of how the service might be positioned. And we settled on a couple of statements. Well, the customer, in our case, is the clinician, and we relate strongly to their needs, their focus and priority, as always, is their patients. And everything they do is about improving the patient experience. So taking these statements as our North Stars, if you will, we could then look at everything to do with the service and how the component parts might be arranged. Which, of course, meant I drew lots more terrible pictures. But what we needed now was to look at component parts of a workflow and describe those in terms of it being wholly patient-centered. And to do that, we also needed to consider system interactions across the service based on scenarios in the clinical workflow and all the actors and objects in the ecosystem. Which meant I went in some quite strange directions. As a designer and an information architect, I do love a good metaphor, but I think I went off the deep end a little bit with some of them. So I got a bit fixated on the idea of a patient being a TV show, with the elements of the service being described in relation to that. A bit like a Netflix series, where the patient is the show, but also the star of the show. And I wondered how that would play out with the relationships between entities and the service ecosystem, and how they might come together around the idea of a digital service like BBC iPlayer, like the example here in the bottom right. John Smith, episode 1. Tom has a tricky aortic aneurysm at work. First Joan, May the 5th, 2017. But back in the real world, I was actually mapping out the ecosystem to try and make sense of how we might plan for product integration, workflow optimization, and extensibility to enable these new service features. So I had to look at things at a story level to understand how the workflows, interfaces, and objects in the system came together to enable us to plan, design, and ultimately build the service. So working closely with Cydar and clinicians, we followed through as many stories as we could to evaluate the service design and stress test our thinking. And I looked in some detail at future service concepts to ensure we didn't design and build something that precluded us expanding and enhancing the service over time. And I was also forward thinking to interface concepts across the service to bring the products together as a coherent service experience when some of the component parts were not yet built, or even included third-party services as part of the existing workflow. And ultimately, everything came together in a kind of service architecture diagram, because I love a good architectural diagram, that was the most complete version at that time of the end-to-end clinical workflow across system boundaries and platforms. But crucially, it was based on the patient experience and their touch points with Cydar as a service, as part of their ongoing treatment from the wider health service. So I mentioned at the beginning of the story that I have a simple rendition of what human-centered design means: understand people to make better things. But during my adventures in surgical UX, I've seen a whole new set of amazing and unique things: new languages, new contexts, new priorities that have enabled me to step back a little from that simplified view. So it's really been about understanding people, but also language, context, ecosystems and services, to get a true picture of what you are designing, why you're designing it, and ultimately who you're designing it for. Thank you. That's all I had to run through with you today. That was my whistle-stop tour of 4 years in surgical UX. Was there a certain process that helped you keep organized? Oh dear. Paul, no, not really. I'm famously disorganized. I work for an agency, so we have our own internal processes anyway in terms of running projects and programs of work. And although this was over 4 years, it wasn't solidly 4 years working with the same client. So our relationship came and went with Cydar. We had projects going on, then we didn't, then we had projects, and we didn't, and then it was like a service architecture thing, and then there wasn't. And so I suppose the best way to articulate that is that we managed our engagement with our client, Cydar, on a project by project basis. On the back end, with the best will in the world, internal to foolproof, we maintain a record of all the things that we have done, all the things that we have made and delivered, and all the conversations we had. So particularly around research, all those things are recorded and stored, relating to local laws and everything. With regard to this being a product in healthcare, there were certain things that we had to do for legislative reasons. So any design decision we made based on insight we had gathered, we had to document that in a design tracker. I think it was for FCA approval in the US. In fact, we had to document every design decision such that we weren't account for liability for compliance reasons. So yeah, so all sorts of kind of discrete processes going on. But honestly, Paul, my organisation is woeful. So I'm surprised the whole thing hung together, to be honest. Hope that answered that question. Frederick, it can be tough to get surgeons to agree on things. So how did you do to get an interface design that was accepted by many? Yeah, interesting. Well, as I think Liz mentioned, others have mentioned, it was an iterative process. So while we did, a lot of the products were already being used by surgeons. So the in-theatre product, the planning product, they were kind of already using these. So my relationship with those was existing users. So part of the process obviously was to interview, get in-depth contextual research around that, and then loop back. It wasn't just like, oh, thanks, we've talked to you. That's very interesting. We can design it. There you go. Thanks very much. Part of the advantage of the Cydar platform is that they can, again, I don't work for Cydar, I just like, part of the advantage of Cydar is it's all in the cloud. So they can make micro updates or small changes to the system and the platform and just feed those back into the cloud at any time. Actually, worryingly, the designs I made for the in-theatre application, I made my best guess. Based on the research, I did what I thought was good design. I fed that back to Cydar and the team, had a chat with the developers about how that worked, and just left it with them for a minute. And about 2 days later, I got a call from them saying, oh, thanks for that work, it's live. I said, what do you mean by live? He said, oh yeah, they're using it in theatre. I was like, well, wait, wait a minute. Okay, are you okay with that? No one's going to die, are they? So actually the workflow was really efficient, scarily efficient, in fact. But the adoption and the loop back with surgeons was constant. While my engagement with Cydar kind of came and went, they were in theatre all the time because the product was there, and they had a relationship with surgeons and clinicians, so they were also helpful in acquiring iterative and ongoing feedback as part of the process. So yeah, a little bit of both, mostly through research, but it was based on actually them having a relationship with the surgeons and trust holders in the NHS who were making the decisions about which products and services to use in theatre. I think as that relationship which enabled us to get a constant loop of feedback. Would have been really difficult otherwise. Key point there, if you have a relationship with people inside the hospital, that's gold dust. If you don't, it's almost impossible. Last question, Bob. Can you describe any major pivots in your design decision direction that resulted from inputs from surgeons? Well, yeah, I mean, it seems obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me at the time. And I don't know why they did this, but the initial product that we're using in theatre had touchscreen interface. The idea behind that was someone in the control room could touch the screen based on the direction given by a surgeon in theatre. But that was a really awkward handoff and really unsuccessful because you basically had to shout through the control room to move things up, down, left, or whatever. And so most of the stuff in theatre had lots of buttons that you couldn't press. And so there did come a point at which we just said, you've got to make a decision about whether that's a capability you need to support. Because they did have an all-in-one hardware system as well, but now they just have it on standard TV screens. So a big pivot point was like, you've got to decide based on the research what the interaction model is for this system. If you can't touch it, why do you offer that capability? Because that's just super frustrating. Some people in theatre could kind of, who weren't scrubbed up, like the radiologist, could sometimes lean over and touch a button, but it's really, really awkward. So yeah, it's like a big decision based on insight was just like, nobody wants to touch it because they can't. Why do you offer that capability? So that's just one example. There are a few others, but I think that's the best example of like a big decision based on surgeons going, what is the point of that? I've got one more question. I'll cover that quickly, and then we can do that. Can you share? Lucia. Can you share some insights regarding voice recognition UX parameters for these kind of products? Yes, I can. The developers of this system had tried and trialed both voice interaction and gestural based interaction for the in-theatre product. So for moving things around on screen or using basic voice commands to change context and change like views on the screen, they had trialed all of those things. I wasn't personally involved in those, it's before we came along, but I know that they were quite spectacularly unsuccessful, particularly with voice. I think at the time, it was probably 6 or 7 years ago they were doing this now, so the hardware, I think, was still not that well developed, and so it was unreliable at best, and agreeing on reserved words that they could use for like a controlled vocabulary to control things via voice was difficult to do as well. I think there was just like some systemic kind of hardware and interface problems, and the voice control didn't work particularly well. Again, with gestural control, they used all sorts of things like Xboxes and all sorts of other Leap, all sorts of bits of hardware to trial and test kind of non-touch interactions, because that seems an obvious choice. If you can't touch a thing, how else do you interact with it? I think they're looking at that again now that the hardware capabilities are so much better than before, but in their initial trials with that, it was actually more annoying to stop and talk to a thing or stop and do a gesture in the air when actually you're trying to stick wires up people's arteries and keep them alive. I think that was one of the main things. You've got a bit like the remote control device. You've got 2 levels of abstraction when you're looking at screen and trying to work on a patient, and then you've got to do a third kind of thing like gesture or voice input. It was just too much cognitive overload for something which we were hoping to make simpler. So hopefully that answered that question. Super, thanks for those questions. Iggy, I think I'm probably done, and I can sit back and watch the next one.